Tonight, on History, So It Doesn't Repeat, we ask the question, what is truth? Beginning with defining our reality and juxtaposing it to the propaganda we've been fed throughout history, we'll discover a method of cognitive liberty and peer into the origins, form, and function of intellectual self-defense. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up next on History, So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History, So It Doesn't Repeat. I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and tonight's episode is especially designed to address the major philosophical pitfalls that we're likely to encounter in our lives. And because it's a place where we need to draw our metaphorical line in the sand, we need to have a better understanding of these concepts of self-defense in an intellectual capacity. I've invited a very special guest whose work exemplifies the study of solipsism, or the negation of the idea of objective truth as juxtaposed to existence, natural law, and the objective truth in which our individual rights are rooted. Mark Passio's prolific work can be found at whatonearthishappening.com, and his podcast of the same name is a perfect complement to that which we publish here at Tragedy and Hope. Mark, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule of media production. Let's start with a simple definition in your own words. How would you define the word truth?
I would simply define truth as that which is, that which has actually undergone the actuality of occurring. It's nothing more complex or more involved than that. People want to make the idea of truth, something so mystical. It's the mind of God. That's not the way I look at what truth actually is. It's that which has occurred and is occurring. If you want to look at it even like in a scientific way, it's the collapse of the wave functions of possibility. Okay, so there's possibility that exists in the present moment, and at some future moment, that wave function of possibility of all the things that are possible in the now, at some future point will collapse to become that which actually has occurred. So that's that demystifies this whole concept, and it's just the events that have occurred in the past and are occurring in the present.
In your opinion, what should be the connection between truth, that which has occurred in objective reality, to the concept of history?
Well, I think then human perception enters into the picture, because it's all about how people perceived those events occurring and how they then record them for future posterity. So the concept of perception being reality is what's ultimately false and has to be understood as such. Perception is not reality. What human beings' work in consciousness is to do is to align perception to reality so that they can actually have a more accurate understanding of the truth, or in other words, that which has occurred.
In your opinion, or through your experience, does truth exist independently from perception?
Absolutely. Perception is just that. It means to see through. That's what perception means when you break it down into its etymological roots. So it's seeing through the lens of the individual, through the lens of their mind. And there's many different perspectives, but that perception does not necessarily align to what actually did occur. That is independent and objective. And again, perception can be aligned with that, or it can waver very wildly from that actuality.
I recall recently seeing and reviewing again your YouTube video, which is it's a redo of your Free Your Mind 2 presentation.
Yes.
It's about the suppression of the sacred masculine, which is the right of self-defense. Whereas the sacred feminine, if I recall, was the non-aggression principle. And when combined, you can live a serene life that is non-contradictory to reason. So particularly during that presentation, I think it was about 2 hours and 40 minutes in, maybe 48 minutes in, it was slide 51 that was juxtaposing the idea that perception is reality. And that was such an interesting kernel and concept that I thought maybe if you recall what slide 51 was, you can just recap what we've talked about, because I think maybe the first couple questions, people didn't catch how they all come together in the answer.
Sure. I think what you were referring to is I showed a little model of some lines with some wave functions, waveforms. And there was the horizontal axis, okay, acts as the truth. If we want to look at that line that does not waver as what is, okay, when you have a wave of low vibration, of low frequency, what that means is that its wavelength actually is very long. And so as it comes to the axis, which we're basically looking at as truth here in this model, it hits it very infrequently. So it is a low frequency vibration. As we move up to a higher frequency, the wavelength gets shorter and shorter, and therefore it hits the axis, which we're referring to as truth here, much more frequently, and therefore it is a higher frequency. The higher we go, the more aligned the wave, which is perception, okay, comes with that line, which is truth. So again, we're looking at perception in a sense of frequency, just like a wave would come into alignment with the horizontal axis about which it wavers much more frequently when the vibration is higher, when the actual frequency is higher. So perception is about attuning our frequency to the truth such that it comes into contact with it very, very frequently and only wavers from it slightly. That's what our work is to do. It is to align our perception by raising our frequency, our vibratory energy, and bring it into alignment with that which is, instead of keeping it in opposition to that which is by refusal to accept truth.
Well, and these concepts of truth and frequency and perception intersecting, I think it does help to have the graphics and the pictures. I think maybe when I put it in my podcast, the last episode 74 of the Peace Revolution, some of it was lost on people because they didn't have the slides, but I also let them know, hey, listen to it and then go watch the slide presentation and learn it two different ways. And one of the things that I'm realizing as I go through it is that truth has a relationship to philosophy. The philosophy is a process of finding truth. So philosophy, as you become more and more familiar with that which exists and the rules of logic and fallacies and these sort of things, that is what physically and metaphorically is raising your vibrational level, the frequency, because you're checking in on reality more frequently because you're building these habits to do it consistently daily. That's a lot
Exactly.
I
mean, that's profound, and that's exactly correct. And if you look at what philosophy means, it means the love of wisdom. It is the process, the continual process, the re-engagement of the will to continue to discover that which is, to continue to align one's perception to reality, and to continue to work, to diligently work to develop principles. Principles are what philosophy is ultimately based upon, and principles are always based in that which is true.
Well, now that we've defined truth, let's juxtapose that idea to the concept of belief, because I know that also plays a major theme in all of your episodes.
Absolutely. You know, I talk so much about natural law and how this is the key to ultimately unlocking the prison that humanity exists in. Natural law is something that needs to be discovered, and it doesn't involve belief. Belief is just going with whatever perception you happen to have at the time or what you've been told. It doesn't involve actual fact checking. It doesn't involve alignment with what is. It doesn't involve the tuning of perception to that which has actually existed and has occurred. It's essentially the imagination run away from the individual. You know, the imagination is very powerful, and it's important for us to visualize something different for ourselves and then go out and create that. But if we just let it run unchecked, it can turn into naivete and blind belief. And also, what can happen if we have a more left-brained approach that's overly left-brain, we can develop into a mindset that is rigidly skeptical, and that actually looks like belief and is belief in many ways, because the person has this idea of knowledge that they're holding on to that isn't in alignment with what is, yet they're so convinced that they're accurate that that so-called knowledge has become like a religion to them, and they're also operating through belief, even in that left-brained modality. So belief is normally a right-brain modality, but again, when rigid skepticism comes into play, it can also come about from a left-brained imbalance. So belief ultimately, regardless of what form of imbalance it comes about through, has absolutely nothing to do with what is. It has nothing to do with the ability to discover that which is. That comes about through it. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that natural law is ultimately a science that is knowable. It isn't a belief system. It's different from a belief system because a belief system doesn't depend on a process of observation and checking and actual deep understanding of something that is actually occurring. It's really only a process that's going on as a mental construct in the mind with no actual verifiable evidence to back up that perception. So that's what makes natural law a science and much different from a belief system, which again does not have that process of fact-checking, observation, and discovery behind it to verify it.
So then, following along with that, where do beliefs begin and where do beliefs end?
I would say beliefs ultimately begin with someone not wanting to take on the personal responsibility to discover truth for themselves. It comes from some sort of a imbalance within the self that is based upon, I would call it self-loathing, because the person somehow feels feelings of inadequacy, that they cannot actually go through that process of discovery for themselves. And therefore, they would rather not do that work and would rather, because of these feelings of inadequacy, and they would rather simply listen to what someone else has said on any given subject or topic and take that into themselves as a belief instead of actually looking at what's there for themselves, which requires a lot of diligent work, especially at the phase of humanity where we find ourselves at today, in which the human mind is very, very controlled and has basically become like an atrophied muscle that has not been used for so long. So we have to develop a lot of self-respect in order to get back to square one, where we even want to do that hard work of truth discovery. So I would say belief ends when that self-respect has been developed, and then the person wants to do the work. They've developed the desire to do that diligent and difficult, oftentimes, work to go through that process of truth discovery.
How would you juxtapose the structure that you just laid out to the definition of the word prejudice?
I would say that word is the ultimate form of ignorance, because to judge something before you've actually really looked into it, which is what prejudice means, to prejudge, is the epitome of ignorance. I mean, I don't think there's any better definition for the height of hubris and ignorance than deciding how something is before you've even looked into it one iota. And that's what prejudice ultimately is.
So now let's enter into the concept of authority. And before we talk about authority and the mindset that creates authority and supports it, let's distinguish it from somebody who might have a compartmentalized expertise in a certain subject area as somebody who's knowledgeable and might help you save your life at some point or something, and people who believe that they have special rights that other people don't have, because
Yes.
I think sometimes people get it
Yes.
easily confused.
Yes, absolutely. When we're talking about the concept of authority, we're referring to the latter concept, which you just expressed. We're not talking about someone who is seen as an authority on on some subject matter. I wouldn't even look at that as authority. That's kind of like a bad misnomer for the entire concept of that. That would just be someone who has knowledge or wisdom regarding a particular topic or a particular aspect of life. And that goes to the concept of who should someone listen to. Who has actual knowledge, who has some gnosis, maybe gained through firsthand direct experience of a thing. that's not the kind of, quote, authority that we're talking about here. When we talk about authority, we're referring to that latter concept which you spoke about, which is the idea that there is a class of individuals living on the earth that are human beings, presumably, and that they somehow have a moral right to issue commands that may not be disobeyed by anyone, regardless of whether those commands are sensible or not. It's the idea that certain people have the moral right to issue orders, and then there's another class of people who have a moral obligation to obey these commands that are often issued at whims or likes or dislikes or preferences by the, quote, authority. And their subjects, in other words, have no right to refuse these commands or orders. So essentially what we're talking about here is that some people are masters. Okay, they are the masters over others, and they have the right to issue these commands, and others are their subjects or their slaves who have a moral obligation to obey those commands regardless of their sensibility or regardless of the truth that is in the commands that are issued, whether they are truthful, whether they are sensible or not. That's what we're talking about when we talk about authority. It is based on this notion that essentially some people belong to other people and may not disobey them and may not go against their word. The concept that underlies authority is the concept of jurisdiction. In other words, basically, this word jurisdiction, meaning that you are under the moral obligation to obey these commands set in your area, in your geographic region of man's law that is issued. This word comes from the Latin. Jus juris in Latin means law, and it can also mean right in Latin. And then there's a verb in Latin where the second part of the word diction comes from. Dictere in Latin means to speak or to say, and we can readily see that because diction means speech in English. So dictere means to speak or to say, and jus juris means law. So what we get when we put them together is to speak the law, to say what the law is. That's all jurisdiction is, because it's based in moral relativism, meaning the likes, preferences, or whims at any given time of the, quote, authors of that law in human society, the legislators. So that's what authority is ultimately based upon. People believing that they are the authors of law and that they get to speak these commands into existence, and somehow that makes them morality or immorality and creates some sort of a moral obligation on the part of their, quote, subjects or slaves to obey those commands. That is authority.
Well, and that's also why literacy is a form of slavery until the individual practices a consistent method of critical thinking. And I can't help but noticing that the next step of authority is if you don't listen to their words, they also happen to have a monopoly on force, fraud, and coercion, other forms of aggression, right, to kind of force you into that. Can you talk about the relationship between authority and the monopoly on force? Or are they synonymous?
I would say that they are synonymous, because what authority is it's an illusion. It isn't based in fact. It isn't based in truth. It's a belief system, number one. And it's a belief system that is based in mental imbalance. You could call it a disease. It's a psychological illness. The only people who believe in and condone and practice authority are those who have some level of psychological imbalance, most of the time toward the left brain hemisphere and toward the masculine part of the psyche, because authority is ultimately based in violence. If the commands are refused on the part of the subjects or slaves, then the authorities always respond with saying, well, if you don't do this, if you don't obey these commands, we also possess the right to do violence unto you physically, or even to take that which is yours, to take property which belongs to you as punitive measures. So authority is entirely backed by and based in the concept of violence, the harmful initiation of undue force to another person. So this is a completely erroneous and dogmatic belief system, ultimately. And when we're talking about an erroneous and dogmatic belief system, we are ultimately talking about religion. That's what authority is. Authority is a religion. Many people don't look at it as such, but nonetheless, authority is actually, I want to even clarify, it's a false religion. Okay, religion could take a couple of different connotative definitions. We can look at religion in the negative sense, which is how I'm using it when I talk about authority, as if we go back to, again, its etymological root, it comes from the Latin relegare. Relegare means to tie back, to hold back, or to thwart from forward progress. In this sense, what religion is doing is thwarting us from forward progress in consciousness and understanding of natural law and understanding of truth. So it is a false religion in that regard. You can also translate religion from the Latin out of the verb relegare. Relegare also means to reunite with. Okay, so true religion can reunite us with truth. That's what we need to be reunited with truth and with natural law, with principles. So in a positive sense, religion can act as a reuniter of humanity to the truth. But in the negative sense, it is that which holds us back. And that's the way that I'm using religion when using it in conjunction with authority. It is a false religion. It is something that holds us back from the understanding of how we really should be behaving in accordance with natural law and with true principles in mind.
Well, it's almost as if the individual should practice religion directly in a communication union with the universe and not have a proxy that has been set up so that everyone in the congregation listens to one person in front of the room. It should be there to inspire and let people know factual knowledge about the world and how to thrive and survive and be happy. These are things that everyone's been interested in, but when you look at the 21st century, we're kind of missing that giant storehouse of wisdom that's been passed, it's been scattered to the wind.
Yes.
So I want to get back to, you explained the etymological roots of relegare in its positive and negative forms. I would say right now most organized religion is practicing the negative form to tie people back, and what we're trying to do through philosophy is empower individuals to actually find the truth that exists out there and has been scattered, but it still exists.
That's right.
That's the important part. I want to move into this concept now of natural law. You've mentioned it several times. What is the mind-matter connection, and how does philosophy play a role in synchronizing mind and matter?
Wow, that's a huge question. I think before we even answer that, let's give the listeners an understanding of what I'm referring to when we use the term natural law, because many people will have a connotative definition in their mind. I would rather clear that up and narrow what we're actually talking about when we use the term natural law. I'm using the word natural in the strictest scientific sense, meaning having a basis in nature and reality, based in truth and not made or caused by humankind, not a construct that exists only in the mind of human beings. So this is something that is inherent and something that is objective. It has nothing to do with perception. And then law, again, in the strictest scientific definition, an existing condition that is both binding and immutable. Binding in the sense that it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not, or even understand its operation or not. You are still going to be held under its effects. You are still going to be bound by it, regardless of where you're at, because it's a universal law. Immutable means not able to be changed. Therefore, law is also something that human beings are not, it is not within human beings' power to change these conditions. They are always in effect, and they are unchangeable by anything that we are capable of doing. So when you put those together, natural law is universal, non-man-made, binding and immutable conditions. And what they do, what this whole set of laws does, that we're grouping under the moniker of natural law, is they act as the governing dynamics for human behavior, for the behavioral choices that we make and put into effect. The underlying intelligence in creation, the inherent intelligence in creation, is actually reflecting back to us through its ordering principles and its governing dynamics, the result of what we have put out into the universe through our behaviors. So it really is that universal law of karma, that as we do will be done to us, as we put into the universe will be reflected back to us. In that sense, the universe acts as a huge mirror to us that which we are emitting, the energies that we are emitting through, and ultimately through our behavior. Now, where the mental connection comes in with that, and philosophy comes in with that, is if you simply envision some basic layers, and at the bottom foundation, okay, we have, or you could even say at the top, let's say, you have the result. It's what you built. It's what people have collectively built. And that's the conditions that the world exists in right now. Under that had to act as a foundation for that, was behavior. Okay, the behavior that we chose was ultimately what put those conditions into effect and created that top level. It was the foundation that led to building on that created the conditions that we exist in now. Then go a little bit deeper. Underneath the behaviors, there has to be decision-making processes, mental processes that ultimately led to the behaviors. Okay, so that's where the mind comes into play. Mind is below that level of behavior that is below the conditions that exist in the world. Now, if you go even deeper than that, what we hold in our mind must be determined by something, because we're not just born with the thoughts that we have now. They are ultimately fed into us, or we feed them into ourselves, simply like loading information into a computer. It's an analogy that actually holds true. I'm not saying human beings are computers. I'm saying that the mind is like a computer that we load with either good software or bad software, with a good operating system or a bad operating system. And therefore, that mental information is what leads to the behavioral choices that we have chosen that ultimately create the reality that we experience. But go one level deeper than that. Underneath that is the world of grammar and words, okay? And this is what ultimately, or in other words, information in general. And this is what ultimately paves the way for what we can come to understand or to know, okay? So if that information is withheld, is hidden away, and kept very tight to the chest by a very small group of people, or even beyond that, even if it's present, but there is an active and continuous campaign to continuously, nonstop, dissuade people from looking into particular information, that will play into the mindset of people, and they will choose to ignore whole bodies of information that they otherwise could come to know. And that will limit their understanding of how certain things in reality work, like the human psyche, like the laws of nature, like the laws that govern the dynamics of behavior, etc. And in their ignorance of that, their ignoring of that information, you see what the cycle will bring. They will have their worldview and their mental processes based on erroneous notions, or simply notions that lack critical information, and then their behaviors will then be based upon that erroneous information. Therefore, the behaviors will go astray, and then the conditions that manifest will be very antithetical to what they say they want in life. That's the relationship that I would say between the mind and ultimately the effects that we actually see manifesting in the physical world. And that's what natural law is. Natural law is the study of how that actually works.
So after studying your presentation and seeing the way that you've styled it, I've created a slide that basically shows a person in the middle with universals above their head, and particulars are the objective below them. And really what I see the role of philosophy is a convection current of induction and deduction to go from universals to particulars, to go from objective to subjective, and it's keeping ourselves in sync with that truth or reality. And then when you do that habitually, that's raising your frequency, and it matches up to some of your other slides. And so I just wanted to touch on this idea of stimulus and response without thinking. That kind of leads people into what we'll define in a second as solipsism, stimulus response without putting your thinking back in. It negates your choice, because if you're not reflecting a philosophy that is reflective of the world, then you're going to be out of sync, you're going to be in conflict, you're going to have cognitive dissonance, somebody might pathologize your dissent. All these things can happen. And I think that's the one reason that we don't really learn about philosophy in elementary school, in high school, and usually not in college. And if we do, it's usually some slant instead of the liberating keys, the unocculted keys of learning that can set people free.
Absolutely. They're not teaching people how to actually go about truth discovery, the actual methodologies, which you've talked so much about, the TRIVIUM. And they're basically getting them to simply accept repeatedly. This can not only lead to, naivete and blind belief. I would say even beyond something like solipsism, the most dangerous thing that mental abdication, let's call it, okay, abdicating one's personal responsibility to actually determine truth for themselves and then align their behavior with that truth, is order following. It leads to someone acting as a willing slave of another and following their orders without question. And that is why they have removed those processes of truth discovery from the modern education curricula, because they don't want people to essentially know that they own themselves. They want people to listen to orders and follow them without question. And, that's really what order following we could define it as. It's someone that is acting on stimulus response mechanisms. It means that you're immediately doing what you're told to do without judging for yourself whether that action that you're being ordered to carry out is right or wrong. That's the definition of order following. So that's what that whole mental abdication process that comes from not wanting to own your own personal responsibility ultimately breeds. And it's a very, very dangerous path to go down, because that's what leads to a totalitarian culture, which is right at the brink of where we're at now, if not in it already.
Well, and I also see that through the Prussian education system, which is designed to create servants and soldiers, they have taken stimulus and response, they've squeezed out thinking, and they've fused these two together. Yep. And so when people receive a stimulus, it's not that you're following orders, it's that you are not taking your chainsaw of logic and cutting that in half, putting some space in there and saying thinking, choice, freedom, these all come from that space. Right. And that is freedom, and this is slavery. When they have the stimulus and response connected without you physically thinking, and thinking is the process of non-contradictory identification. It is the process of using logic and processing your perceptions to be in sync with that which exists. Yes. It's a very healthy process.
That Prussian model, which we call outcome-based education now, it's completely removing that entire middle step of the trivium. It's completely removing the processing stage. It's just throwing a whole lot of the grammar, okay? And then you're taking the whole logic stage out of it. You're saying, don't process this. Just take it and accept it and act on it because we said so. That's exactly what it's doing.
Well, and some of the other problems that we've noticed in history with solipsism can lead to things that are, that look like a dictatorship or totalitarianism or synarchy or, all these different terms that are out there to describe people being denied their individual rights on a daily basis. And that very much is the seed of fear, that unknown, that uncertainty, and the inability to process it into knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, I think causes most of the problems, and that's what freezes people into that stimulus response model. So I'm continually trying to better understand how it works so I can learn for myself and so we can spread the good word with other people. How, in your experience, what's an effective way to help someone who is completely stimulus response take the time and consideration to really put their thinking back in there and show them the value of doing that for their own survival?
Sure. And that's really what I call the great work. That's the hardest work there is to do. It's a great question. And I would say to people who are wanting to get involved in performing that work and helping, once you've rebuilt that muscle yourself and you have that at your command, of course, that's the first step, is to then identify someone who you think is somewhat receptive. I wouldn't recommend going to the person who is so shut down and starting with them, because first of all, that's like trying to build a foreign race car before you've ever even looked into mechanics at all. You have to start with the basic building blocks. You want to work with somebody that you feel is somewhat open-minded, and you want to take it slow at first and build with the basic building blocks. Go back to square one and talk about how we can even come to know what is, and how we have to look at all availability of information. Just present that simple model that I talked about earlier about, hey, behavior in the world is ultimately determining the conditions of the world. And that's based on what we think, and that's based on availability of information. If that model is really understood, people may start to come around and say, well, maybe I don't have all the information that I need to make correct decisions. Maybe I have ignored certain things, and maybe their mind will open up a little bit, and then you can fill in the gaps for them or help them to fill in those gaps for themselves. Ultimately, you have to help to build that person up back to a point where they want to do it on their own. That's very difficult. And then you have to know when to back off too, because then it could become a control situation. You have to give them enough, but not too much. And you have to kind of make them want more as you go. It's like, giving someone who's very, very, very starving a whole lot of food all at once might be harmful to them because the body's not ready to accept it all at once. So give them a little until they're ready for more, and then give them some more. Then at some point, when you know that they're going to do this work on their own, that's the time to back off, because they've developed that desire. And that's really the spark toward going all the way and developing true wisdom. So once they have that desire within them, that's the time where, you could take the training wheels off and let them ride that bicycle on their own.
Well, I think you're hitting on the keys of knowing thyself to get to a point of autonomy, of self-rulership. Right. And to do that, you have to start with yourself internally and work out in that direction. So that brought these ideas that you had mentioned separately together in my head. So that you mentioned philosophy and principles. We have philosophy to have principles and live by principles. But you also mentioned natural law as this sort of boundary condition. And can you tie those together? Because it seems like the boundary condition of natural law is almost synonymous with the principles that you get from an objective philosophy of that which exists.
I would say that these boundary conditions are ensuring that if we choose principles, then we will receive an orderly existence. And conversely, if we choose to ignore principles that are based upon truth, and therefore ultimately ignoring truth, we will receive a chaotic existence. That's basically how these boundary conditions that I'm calling natural law function. So they are the deterministic component to creation. A lot of people fall into a worldview schism, whereas they see the world as either completely random and purposeless, or completely deterministic and preordained, when in fact there is a combination between these two components that ultimately is what's occurring, that is the truth about what's occurring in our reality. The deterministic component is natural law of creation, the boundary conditions that are the governing dynamics for behavioral choices. But human beings have also been gifted with free will. This is the randomness component to creation, and we have the free will to either align our perceptions with truth and therefore to align our behavior with principles and morality, or we have the free will not to do those things, to just keep our behavior in complete discord with principles and morality and natural law. And in the event where we align our behaviors with natural law, again, we receive order, we receive the absence of self-inflicted suffering, we receive all the things that we say that we want in life: harmony, peace, justice, knowledge, freedom, ultimately. And if we refuse to align our behaviors with these boundary conditions called natural law, then we receive all the opposite of what we say we want, which is chaos, injustice, and ultimately slavery. And you can see that's what's happening in the world today, is that because our perceptions have gone so wildly out of sync with truth and with reality and with principles and with natural law, we are receiving that chaotic result. And what our work is to do is help people to understand that relationship between free will choice, which is the random component in nature, and natural law, which is that deterministic component that exists within the universe.
So if we're not exhibiting and demonstrating our free will, free choice, thinking, these sort of things, we will end up breaking natural law, which will put us into chaos.
Yes.
What we're seeking to get to is order, because that's where we can be serene, familiar with our surroundings, self-confidence, self-reliance, self-esteem. Is a process like learning? Does it give people the ability to process that chaos and actually achieve order? And if so, has it somehow been occulted because it's useful to certain groups through time to think that order out of chaos is really scary and we should be in fear of the words?
Absolutely. Learning, true methods of learning have everything to do with this. Okay. And this is the reason that they want to obscure those methods of learning. In other words, if someone is actually prevented from understanding how something works, okay, while other people fully know how it works, a tremendous power differential is created. Okay. In that divide.
That's leverage.
Exactly. And that's what has occurred. If certain people keep that information occulted, okay, or even, again, it doesn't even have to be deliberately kept back, hidden, physically kept back. It doesn't have to be. All that has to happen is that one group has to continuously dissuade or discourage the masses from looking into it by saying, oh, there's nothing to that information. That's nonsense, or that's bad, that's evil. You shouldn't ever even look into that. When that happens, this small group has all of that knowledge and information, and they know how it actually works. And then they're dissuading other people from looking into it. So ignorance abounds in that larger group, and then that power differential comes out of that equation, and then it becomes a piece of cake for that small group that has that knowledge to ultimately control the thoughts of the larger group, and ultimately to control their behavior.
Okay, so combining this natural law idea with the ideas of Aristotelian philosophy, the axiom of existence is that things exist. The axiom of identity is they are what they are, and the other one is consciousness. The things exist, they are what they are, and we are conscious of that. That kind of is the breakdown of natural law in my understanding. Yes. And when I see people dissociated from that understanding, they live a life in fear. And my question is about fear, the nature of fear. My observation has been that fear is innately tied to the loss of your freedoms according to natural law, whether it's a spider or a burglar or any of these other things that people fear. And I find that learning is an effective way to transition that into understanding and the actionable response ability, the ability to respond to our life situations, which ultimately leads to serenity and happiness. Can you talk about why those types of ideas are disconnected in our society? Sure.
There's so much in this question. And, it comes down to fear is the basis of all forms of chaos and disorder. Okay. And it's what holds us in the condition that the human species is in right now, which is a condition of ultimately the loss of freedom and moving into total slavery. You talked about how ultimately knowledge is what dispels fear. Okay, we fear that which we do not understand. So this is a good time to talk about solipsism, because solipsism is the ideology that you can't know anything. Therefore, you'd ultimately continuously be held in fear. Solipsism, for those who haven't heard of the term, it comes from the Latin. Solus in Latin means alone or one. Okay, and then the pronoun ipse means the self in Latin. So solipsism means essentially all by oneself, all alone. It's the ideology that there is no truth because there's no objective reality, that the only thing that exists is the contents of one's perceptions. So the only one's perceptions are sure to exist. And knowledge outside of anything outside of one's own perceptions is completely unknowable. It's unsure. And, therefore there's no truth. And the universe revolves around our perceptions at any given time. Now, if that's one's ideology, that means you can never truly come to know anything. Nothing about the external reality can really be known. There's no objective reality, so you can't know anything. Therefore, how could you possibly dispel fear with an ideology like that, because you can't know anything. And that's what knowledge is ultimately about. It's about saying, well, I've identified this. I can understand it now because I have identified it. I know what it is. I know how it works. There's nothing to fear then if I understand those things. Now I could align my behavioral choices with how this process works because I understand it. And that's what wisdom is. It's what you do with what you have come to understand through knowledge. So knowledge, then understanding, and then what you do with it becomes wisdom in the world. So how this ties into our ability to respond to any given situation is, if we do not develop that knowledge and understanding and then put it into practice in our lives, we're always going to be in a state of fear. We're always going to lack the understanding which dispels fear, and then our behaviors are ultimately going to be chaotic. They're not going to align with natural law. They're not going to align with reality. And we're going to get things that we say we don't want. We'll say we want, a certain thing, but then our behaviors are ultimately betraying our thoughts. And then we're getting something that is completely the opposite of what we said we originally wanted. This has everything to do with the abdication of personal responsibility. And again, it goes back to a childlike mentality of wanting to be told, of wanting to be cared for, of wanting to be kept, without growing up and learning for oneself, even if that process of learning means that you might encounter periods of chaos by not getting it right at first, by doing the wrong thing. Chaos shouldn't be feared, because again, if you're on the path of fear, you're on the path to chaos. Chaos should be seen as a teacher that teaches us through the negative what not to do. In other words, Tesla would often say that he tried to invent something and did it 100, maybe 200 times and got it wrong before he finally got it right. And he learned through the process of failing what not to do, how not to invent something. Okay, so it's that idea that chaos is a teacher, and it shouldn't be feared as such. It gives us the opportunity to find out, to learn, hey, what did I do wrong here? And how do I have to adjust my thinking and ultimately my actions to get it right and to get what I say I wanted to manifest? So, when people are in fear of something not working out, if they're in fear of, well, if there isn't this kind of control in place, how would things work? Ultimately, what they're doing is they're abdicating their own personal responsibility to learn and discover how they should make things work for the better without certain negative things in place, like the control of other human beings. Ultimately, that leads to the death of the imagination, because the person stops thinking about, how could I possibly make something different manifest than the way things already are? Once you're in that position, I would say that you're pretty much done, because if the imagination is dead, you can't envision a better future. You can't envision doing anything differently than you're already doing. It's equivalent to death, to mental death, in other words. And that's where the state wants people at. That's where the control system wants people. They don't want people to even be able to envision a different outcome. And again, one of the ways we do that is through the learning process, the truth discovery process. But another way we do that is through owning our personal responsibility to discover the truth for ourselves, not handing that away or trying to abdicate it to someone else and say, you just tell me how it is. Each person has to go through that process of discovery for themselves to learn how it actually is and align their perception to that reality. So that's what the ability to respond comes from. It comes from making that conscious free will decision for oneself to own one's responsibility to go down that learning process for themselves, which is an act of work and effort. And again, if we simply look at the idea of evil as being born out of that refusal to own that personal responsibility, and then you start looking at where that comes from, what is the origin of that mindset. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about self-loathing, because the person hasn't developed enough self-respect to develop the will, the desire to want to go through that process of work upon themselves, then you get down to, where does that come from? Where does that self-loathing and that refusal, that lack of self-respect and refusal to own one's own personal responsibility come from? This is a profound understanding, because when we're talking about the refusal to grow up, the refusal to own personal responsibility, the refusal, the inability seemingly to develop true self-respect, these are characteristics of a child. These are not just characteristics of a normal child either. They're characteristics of a child that has undergone trauma. And I would suggest they're characteristics of a child that has undergone trauma due to abandonment issues. Mommy and daddy abandonment issues, literally. I think that's what underlies the entire thing, what underlies the entire control system, and the refusal to own that personal responsibility, develop that self-respect, and go through that learning process for oneself. And all one really needs to do, this ties in with authority very easily and readily. It's very simple to see if we look at the false left-right paradigm between, the left and right. The left wants the quote authorities, the government, to be the caretakers. This is like an abandonment issue of the mother. The mother not being present, then those in that state of trauma and psychological imbalance want that mother to be there and acting as the nurturing caretaker and the provider. That's what the left often wants government to behave as. And the right wants the opposite. That's the daddy issue, the daddy abandonment issue. They want the government, the quote authorities, to act as the protector, the one that will police the world and keep everybody safe. So you see this abandonment issue comes into play in the so-called political spectrum between left versus right. That's what I believe underlies that entire process of ultimately holding people back from wanting to go through that truth discovery process of true learning for themselves. And it's something that I'm going to be talking a lot about in future What on Earth is Happening podcasts.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning, fear is the mind killer, and it stops us from thinking. And so that state of fear leaves us in an extended state of adolescence.
Yes.
People who aren't growing up, but they're of adult size and they have adult rights, but they're thinking and acting like children. And so the connection between evil, solipsism, and narcissism. Narcissism seems to be like you are the center of your own universe and nothing else matters. There were no people who lived on this planet before you. There are no people that are going to live after you. And so that mentality of narcissism might help someone adopt, hey, solipsism seems to justify my needs. And once they do that without resistance, then you see evil rear its ugly head, which is irrationality that goes on, it is tolerated and not dismissed and not addressed. And that's how people get hurt in the world. So our idea is to stay away from evil by learning how to recognize when it happens and what are the conditions that make it, very potent, and to help de-escalate all these things in our society that we see have been purposely put there to create that type of chaos. So can you comment on what it takes to, not only observe these ideas and study them for yourself, but the labor of love that is taking your knowledge and creating pieces of media and providing it to the public in a variety of ways. What is the spark between what we've been talking about and what you're doing right now? Is there a connection between your philosophy and your actions, is what I'm saying?
Of course. Very, very important connection. To go back to solipsism, if you take on that idea that there is no truth to arrive at, that it's just all perception, that will ultimately feed into other ideologies. It will feed into moral relativism, because if there's no truth, then there can't really truly be morality. There can't really be objective right or wrong if there's no objective truth, because then, how could there possibly be a real difference between right and wrong? So solipsists will often go into the ideology of moral relativism. And then from moral relativism, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to totalitarian thinking. Because if there's no right and wrong, man gets to decide what's right and wrong for himself. It's not something that has to be discovered through a truth discovery process. We could just get to make it up according to our likes or dislikes or preferences or whims or perceptions. So you can see that relationship between the idea that, oh, truth is a dirty word and there's no such thing as objective truth. That ideology will invariably lead to moral relativism, and moral relativism is how we go into a totalitarian society. You know, in natural law, there's a simple law called the law of freedom, and it states that freedom is proportional to morality. The amount of morality that is present in the individuals in any given society will ultimately determine the amount of freedom that they experience or lack thereof. So as morality increases, freedom increases. And as morality declines, freedom declines. These two things are inextricably interwoven with each other and can never be separated. So when you understand that, and you recognize for yourself, when you've come to a full understanding of that, and then you've recognized that the very large majority of human beings on this planet do not understand that relationship, then the labor of love, or what you could call the great work, is to help to educate them. Only education can dispel ignorance. Ignorance is acting as the path to evil in the world through fear. That's why people remain ignorant. They fear what they do not understand, and therefore they don't make that choice to go through that process of truth discovery for themselves. So the only way around that is through true education, which means to lead one out, to help to act as a guide to lead one out. It doesn't mean controlling anybody. It doesn't mean forcing them to take on an idea. It means acting as an example to help lead them out of their ignorance and out of darkness. Education is ultimately leading one out of the darkness and to the light. So that work becomes I feel, a moral responsibility by the people who do understand how these natural laws function in our world to ultimately bring to us the manifestations of what we put out into the universe through our behavior. That is the true great work, to help to enlighten people as to how those laws function. And very few people want to take on that work because they intuitively, or even at a conscious level, recognize how calcified the human ego has become and how deep of a level of mental control people are under through the media systems, through the indoctrination systems, through all the institutionalized systems of this world. And that dissuades a lot of people who are knowledgeable from actually going into the actual the work of helping to influence other people to come online to that knowledge for themselves. It's a very unpopular work, but again, it is the most important thing that can be done, because only through that process of assisting other people to educate themselves and to share what you have already come to learn, and to do this in a very straightforward, unapologetic way that doesn't pull any punches and just tells things to people as it is, as you would have respect for another person and tell it to them like an adult, not to sugarcoat anything, not to go overboard and step across the line and become aggressive with it, but be straightforward and put it out there in a way that is unapologetic and is done in a way that is done in an air of confidence and knowing, so that you can project to this person that this is information that really does need to be understood if we are going to be able to create our reality on a conscious level in a way that is orderly.
Well, and I likewise agree, especially with educare, which means to lead out. It comes from the Latin, but it also means to unoccult. And it doesn't say shove people out and into the light. It says, hey, lead them out. Show them by going out and doing it yourself, and let them learn from the experience. And really, people don't have to think about it as being a formal teacher, but just think about it as learning stuff for yourself and sharing with friends and family. You don't have to become an authority or a teacher. Just start to share the wealth and let people know that there's an infinite amount, and we can all share it, and we can be happy on that level. The other idea that you had touched on is if we don't do these things, if we don't live in accordance with natural law, things like Amtssprache, which was a word I learned while reading through Nuremberg trial transcripts. It means official language. That's the official version. But really what it means is it's a form of dehumanizing language that removes the individual from responsibility because of this belief in authority that told you it's okay. And this is where evil sprung up with the Nazis, because people were just following orders and they don't have any moral responsibility to check themselves and their premises and use philosophy to live in accordance with natural law. But the rest of us do. And that's what we mean by people thinking their authority, that natural law doesn't apply to them, but it applies to us, and people can, continuing to tolerate it through time. So now let's just bridge this, one of these last gaps. What is the relationship between the non-aggression principle and self-defense? And also we might touch on how would you juxtapose violence, the concept of violence, to force?
Okay. So you started out with talking about how when people refuse to go through that learning process, they ultimately become order followers and then fall into patterns of evil behavior. Absolutely. This is because they lack the knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong, for the very reason that they haven't bothered to go through that truth discovery process for themselves. That's what conscience is. Conscience is the knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong. So when we look at someone who has abdicated their personal responsibility to learn that difference for themselves, and then they say, I'll just follow orders and do whatever anyone else tells me to do, therefore I don't have to take on that responsibility of learning for myself. What we have to understand is that action, that behavior of order following is always in opposition to conscience. It doesn't matter whether the order happened to be moral at a particular time or not. One cannot ever be exercising conscience if they are following orders. The two things are always antithetical to each other, because by definition, the exercise of conscience is the willful taking of right action over wrong action, which you have chosen for yourself once you have integrated and understood the knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong behaviors. So following orders doesn't involve that process, that willful active choice process, that free will choice process. It doesn't involve it. You've abdicated it. So that's the pathway that leads to all forms of evil in society, that refusal to give up that responsibility, that refusal to take on and own that responsibility, I should say. Now, what the person ultimately becomes is a purveyor of violence. They're not actually engaged in a monopoly on force. They're engaged in a monopoly on violence, is what an order follower becomes. This is why an order giver, or in other words, a controller, okay, one needs to own the mind of someone, okay? They need to actually have influence over the thoughts of the other person and maintain that influence so that ultimately they're owning their behavior. And they're doing this to insulate themselves from the behavior themselves so that other people take on the brunt of the moral culpability. When we talk about things like Nuremberg, the Nazis tried to use the defense, which became known as the Nuremberg defense, this justification that we're innocent of what we were doing to other people because we can't be held to account of the dastardly actions that we performed upon other people because we were following someone else's orders. They told us to do this, and therefore we just obeyed it because they were the authorities. Well, that didn't work at Nuremberg, and it shouldn't work anywhere. That so-called defense, that justification, should always be rejected and should never be accepted for any wrongdoing or immoral behavior. Someone always owns the responsibility to choose for themselves between right and wrong behaviors, between behaviors that cause harm and behaviors which do not cause harm, therefore wrongs or rights. So the refusal to do that, coming from the refusal to own one's personal responsibility, should never be accepted as a justification. Justification literally means an attempt to create a right. That's what it means, an attempt to make a wrong into a right. It comes from, again, the Latin jus, which means right or law, and then the Latin facere, which means to create or to make up, to make. So, and that's, facere is where we get the word fake from in English, to fake. to make a copy of. Okay, so you're trying to fake a right. You're trying to create a right which does not exist. That's what a justification is. And that's all order followers ever really do. They try to offer justification for violence, which is a behavior that one never, ever, ever possesses the right to take. Someone does possess the right to take defensive use of force when they are accosted with violence. So if violence is done, and let's just look at what these terms actually are. Force is the capacity to do work or create physical change in the world. It's a very scientific definition of what force is, okay? And we have to look at it simply as such. Get the idea of coercion should be looked at as different than force. See, that's one of the reasons why they try to obfuscate it and say forcing someone to do something instead of saying violating someone's free will to try to make them do something. Force is simply the ability to do work with energy. Violence, on the other hand, is coercive action. It's coercive behavior that one never possesses the right to take against another person, because in the taking of that behavior, you are stealing something that does not belong to you, which is what all wrongdoings ultimately boil down to, a form of theft. What you are stealing when you take violent action is someone's free will. You're taking their free will choice away from them. And then you're also taking, if you follow through with the action, with the violence, if you threaten them with violence, you're taking their free will choice. You're attempting to take their free will choice. And then if you follow through with the action, you're actually taking their right to remain unharmed in their physical person away from them. So violence is something that is initiation of undue usage of your ability to do physical tasks in the world, and you're using that in a coercive capacity against another human being or against another being in general in a way that you have no right to do that behavior. Therefore, violence is always in opposition to natural law, and one never has the right to take it, because the taking of violent behavior always involves the violation of someone else's natural law rights, again, to exercise their own free will choice so long as they harm no one else, and to basically remain unharmed in their physical person. So there's a total dichotomy between force and violence. Force is in harmony with natural law, and one has the right to do it. We use force to do everything we're going to do. Any physical behavior involves the use of force. It crosses the line and becomes violence when it becomes the coercive use of force against another's free will or against their body when they have not done anything wrong. Okay, that's what violence is. So what a controller in the control system is always doing is violence. They're always harming someone else through the use of force in a capacity in which they had no right to take it, which is violent behavior. We have to understand the difference between those things. That when force is being used to, let's say, collect taxes, okay? I'm sorry, when violence is being used, not force. When violence is being used to collect taxes, we have to distinguish that from force. That's not force, that's violence. Because what you're doing is you're saying the product of your labor belongs to me. If you do not turn over the arbitrarily chosen product of your labor, which I've decided I'm going to confiscate, I am claiming the right to do physical violent behavior to you. When someone makes claims of being allowed to do violence to somebody, there's always the right to defend oneself with physical force. Now, most people don't understand that, or they think that right does not exist. Nonetheless, it does actually continue to exist and always has existed. There is never a time when that right does not exist. If someone is coming up to me on the street and they brandish a weapon and they say, I want all of your possessions, give me whatever you have in your pockets, your wallet, your money, whatever jewelry you may have on you, etc., even your clothes. And they would say, if you don't do this, I'm going to do physical harm to you with this weapon. You always maintain the right to physically, through forceful behavior, defend your physical body and your property with the usage of force. This is the sacred masculine principle, which is part of the two-pillar system, which ultimately expresses all natural law. there's really only two overarching dynamics or principles which one has to understand natural law in general. That's the sacred feminine or non-aggression principle, which is do not engage in violent behavior. Very simply, do not engage in violence. Violence, or the coercive action being initiated against your fellow beings, is always a wrongdoing and should never be engaged in. Okay? That's the sacred feminine, or what is known as the non-aggression principle. In union with that, in marriage with that, in harmony with that, we must bring into wedding with that the sacred masculine principle, or in other words, the self-defense principle. The self-defense principle is if one is being accosted with violence, or in other words, the initiation of coercive action, which one does not possess the right to take, okay, against their fellow human beings, then always reserved is the right to use defensive force against the being who is exerting that initiation of violence. Okay. So again, if someone were to take their own weapon out and use it against that attacker that mugged them on the street to try to rob them or do harm to them and take their valuables and their possessions, that would not be an act of violence. That would be a defensive act of force. It would be an act of self-defense. And we always maintain that right, regardless of what any law anywhere in the world says. That right is always ours. Again, people have been worked into the mental condition where many people believe that is not a right, but that belief is erroneous and is not based in truth, and it is not based in the principles of either self-defense or non-aggression. So these two basic overarching principles are what have to both be fully understood and wedded together in a union from which they cannot be separated from each other. That is the two pillar principles, the two principles that we have to fully understand if we are going to understand how natural law really works and thus truly enlighten ourselves as to what's going on around us. Many people don't understand one or the other. So you have many groups. For example, I'll use two groups. Let's look at the Tea Party and the New Age movement. The Tea Party very well understands the sacred masculine or the self-defense principle. And these are people who are big Second Amendment supporters and big supporters of the natural right to own weapons for self-defensive purposes. They get the self-defense principle with no problem. It doesn't have to be explained to them at all. But many of them don't quite understand the non-aggression principle. And, you know, a lot of hardcore right-wing Republican types, they want to act as the policeman for the world. This is a lack of understanding of the sacred feminine principle of non-aggression. Conversely, you have groups that are more right-brained, okay? So, you know, the group I just talked about would be considered a form of left-brained imbalance. But you have the right-brained types that, like the New Age movement, or, you know, maybe some fundamentalist religionists or pacifist type groups, that they don't believe that there's any such thing as the right to self-defense. And they think, well, people should just accept whatever someone else is doing to them, even if it's violent, and should never respond with the necessary usage of force to put down violence if they're accosted with it. Groups like the New Age movement often fall into this category. Not always, not a total blanket statement, but a generalization. They often do fall into that category. Yet they very well understand the non-aggression principle of do not engage in violence to others. They're all for that. But then if violence is being done, they have a very hard time with saying, well, then the right is reserved and remains to be able to use self-defensive force to put down that act of violence if necessary. I would suggest that both of these mind states are half measures and are never going to lead to true freedom. Only a true understanding of a total understanding of both of these principles is ever going to pave the way for an understanding that will lead to true freedom.
That leads us into a very interesting concept of government. So my question is, setting the etymology aside, Describe the form and function of government through history, and is it something that is there to help us reach cognitive liberty, or is it there to help suppress consciousness?
I would say that throughout history, all that government has acted as a tool for is the suppression of the masses of people to the will of a small class of people that ultimately are psychopathic in nature, that want their way regardless of who is harmed. So they don't care about morality, and they don't care about the difference between right and wrong. There is a small class of people in the world like that. And without getting into the origins of psychopathy, it suffices to say that psychopathy actually does exist and is operating in our world. It is a known psychological condition, and it is characterized by people who are absolutely lacking of any form of empathy or compassion for their fellow beings. They simply don't care about what another being experiences, be it suffering or destruction, or slavery. They would be willing to put them through that process of suffering and even slavery if it serves their own means, if it serves their own agenda and their own will to get what they want. Government has always acted as a tool to serve that small psychopathic class of individuals that look at themselves as the ruling class for whatever reason, whether that is divinely appointed by God in their minds, whether it is because they are the intelligentsia that sees themselves as the people who must rule over society for its quote-unquote own good. And this tool called government has always maintained a monopoly on violence in order to carry out the agenda of that very small psychopathic class of that ruling class, which I would say is far below 1% of people. A lot of people look at that as, maybe a multiple percentage. I feel that those numbers are actually overblown, and I think the people who really direct the agendas are a tiny percentage. If it's a half of 1%, I would say that's a lot, a large estimate. So again, the reason it's a piece of cake for them to get people to believe in this is because they continuously dissuade them from looking into real knowledge and real truth discovery methodologies. What they have ultimately convinced, the genius, if you will, or horror, however you want to look at it, in this is they have convinced, the idea of government is they have convinced people that a certain group of people calling themselves government has rights that the majority of people do not possess, and may engage in harmful behaviors that the individual would have no such right to engage in. Conversely, they have simultaneously convinced the majority of human beings in the world, in accepting the idea of authority and government, that the vast majority of people do not have rights that are prohibited by this quote-unquote authority or government, by this small group of people calling themselves government, that the majority of people actually do possess. So again, simultaneously, they've convinced people that this concept called government means that certain people have rights which the majority of people do not have, and the majority of people do not possess rights which they actually do, and that those behaviors may be prohibited by the minority that calls themselves government. It's not too difficult. It's actually quite easy if we have even a small, long view of history. Okay, even if we have just a slight perspective in historical terms of what has gone on here on the earth in the ancient past, to understand that this is simply an extension of the ancient idea of kingship. Okay, so a king was a single ruler who said that his rights to rule came from the Creator. He claimed the divine right to rule, and said that other people had a moral obligation to obey his commands as his subjects because they were subjected to him by this divine right. All that has changed is we have gone from the idea of one person having this magical power of authority vested in them to a group of people having this power diffused through them that call themselves government, magically being imbued with this right to rule. That's all government ever has been. That's all it is now. That's all it ever will be. once again, it's the idea that certain people have rights to perform violent behavior that other people do not have, based on the whim of the legislators who say what the law is, and that other people have this moral obligation to obey their commands, have no right to refuse, and can have violence done unto them if they choose to exercise rights that are prohibited by this lawmaking minority, even if those actions that are prohibited do not harm another human being and therefore are actually rights in reality. That's what government ultimately is. And it's a form of slavery. Let's be honest about what it really is. If we're really being honest and we want to get to the bottom line of what we're talking about here, it is nothing more than slavery. It's just euphemized. It's called government, and we say it's, people try to convince other people that it's necessary, that this form of violence must be done unto people. But ultimately, it's simply a euphemism for violence and slavery, if we're being honest with ourselves.
Well, I think we should be honest with ourselves.
Sure.
And so to recap what you're illustrating for everybody, it seems to be a multi-generational system of interest-specific kleptoparasites, people of the same species who like to plunder our production. We learn helplessness generation after generation, that they don't even have to use violence all the time. It's the threat of violence. There's the threat of the IRS audit that makes you audit yourself 100 times, so they don't even really have to check what you send in because they trust that they've scared you. So
that's duress. That's living under a constant state of duress. Yes.
Right. So outgrowing this learned helplessness, I can't help but think of Etienne de la Boétie and the treatise on voluntary servitude, how we have a role in this. So I want to ask you, as one of my last questions, what is the relationship between the concept of knowledge and our ability as individuals to say no?
That's right. There it is, the lost word. Everything. The relationship between those two things is everything. Because those who do not know their rights, by going through that process of truth discovery regarding natural law and morality and the objective difference between right and wrong behavior, therefore coming to truly know and understand which behaviors are rights because they do not cause harm to others, and which behaviors are wrongs because they do cause harm to others and are the initiation of coercive action against other beings. To know that difference is everything when it comes to the human will to say no to oppression and to say no to slavery. Those who do not know that definitive difference between the objective difference between right and wrong will never say no to those who come at them with violence and have no such right to do so, and are trying to take other people's rights away and trying to take ultimately their freedom away. Neither one of those things is the possession of those people to take. It is those things are our possessions. They are our property. My rights are my property. My life is my property. My freedom is my property. And that's why those are values, okay? They are something that people should value to the point, particularly principles and freedom, to a point where they are willing to defend them at all costs by saying no and being willing, if necessary, to use defensive use of force to protect those possessions, to protect those pieces of property. Ultimately, all rights come down to property rights. All rights have to do with ownership and understanding what we truly own and what we do not own, and therefore not taking that which does not belong to us. You could sum up natural law in one phrase: don't steal. All forms of wrongdoing and transgression against natural law are forms of theft, and they are the taking of property of another being when you have no right to do such a thing. So if we understand that all natural law boils down to is do not steal, that is the one commandment. We don't need 10 or any more than that. We need one. Learn what you own and what you don't own, what's truly yours and what is not truly yours, and don't steal. Don't take that which does not belong to you, including life, rights, and freedom from other people. Yeah, that's what it all ultimately comes down to is when we're saying no to our oppressors and saying no to a society that is based in violence and ultimately in slavery. What we're really saying no to is evil in general. That's what it all ultimately comes down to. And we cannot do that unless we truly know our rights. So the original question of how does knowledge play into that is it plays into it completely, because the ability to say no to evil is ultimately based on what we can come to know in our minds through that process of truth discovery and understanding of natural law.
All right, so let's use the force of thinking to do a little test case, a little use case of this. I'm going to assert that I am an authority and that you are my slave. Do you understand?
No, I do not.
All right.
That's it. I do not understand that. That's what we have to say. I do not understand that. I do not stand under that authority. It does not rule above me. I'm sovereign. I'm not a slave. That's what sovereign means, to be above the external rulership or control of another. And that is the knowledge that has to be developed. When we understand the difference between right and wrong, we understand that we are sovereign and no one has the right to rule over us and make claims that we are their property or that our rights are their property to take as they see fit. That is what sovereignty ultimately is the understanding of. And again, that plays directly into saying no when someone makes the claim that they are an owner or a ruler of another person.
Is resistance futile, or is it the responsibility of every conscious human being?
Absolutely not futile. Resistance is the responsibility of every conscious human being without any doubt in my mind. See, passively accepting something means stagnation. That means you are accepting the default condition. And the default condition will get you nothing but entropy and chaos. It takes the will through what we have come to understand in order to resist that chaos and ultimately build something that is orderly and that is just and that is good. That kind of resistance to evil is what is absolutely needed in our society to be developed by each individual. Otherwise, we're going on that entropic path into a chaotic society. However, if we develop that will to resist and do that in a way such that we withdraw our consent from these evil systems that are currently in place, we will build a world that is based in truth, order, and ultimately freedom.
And last but not least, what are some of the projects that you've been working on that you think people should check into after? If they're interested in this conversation and they want to learn more, where might they check into?
Sure. Well, my main website is whatonearthishappening.com, and there's a tremendous body of material there in the form of videos and also in the form of podcasts. I highly recommend people to go and check out the podcast section where there are extended discussions about this topic, first in the form of radio shows that I hosted in the past, more recently in the form of a pre-recorded podcast. I've done 143 of these to date. We'll be doing many more in the future. And I recommend that people take that body of knowledge from step one. If you go back to podcast number 1 and you proceed forward in a linear progression, this is done with a very specific progression in mind to weave a tapestry and to clear up a lot of misconceptions that people may have, and to help them to approach this information in an orderly fashion such that they are not overwhelmed by it. It is a lot of information, but if you take it a little bit of it at a time in order, I think a new picture can really emerge, and again, a lot of understanding can be developed. That's my main website, whatonearthishappening.com, and I think people should definitely check out the body of information that is available to them on that site.
Well, I know that I've certainly enjoyed consuming your content over the past couple of years, and I can't wait to see what you've got going on next. And I just want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be able to share some of these thoughts in a structured way such that they can proliferate into the future and help people now and in the future.
Richard, thank you so much. And I want to say the incredible work that you're doing. I followed the work that you've been doing through the Tragedy and Hope website, the Peace Revolution podcast, and now History So It Doesn't Repeat Itself. And your work is absolutely top-notch. I think that State of Mind was one of the best documentaries I have ever seen, and I've seen a whole lot of documentaries. So brilliant job on that. Keep up your great work. And thank you so much for having me on your program today.
It was my pleasure. Talk to you soon, Mark.
Take good care.
And with all that being said, you can explore more of Mark's illustrious work at whatonearthishappening.com. And if you'd like to know more, be sure to visit tragedyandhope.com and dig into the Peace Revolution podcast. Fly with me on Twitter to see a useful timeline of artifacts and articles. And visit the Tragedy and Hope online community, where you can wade further into the world of self-responsibility, autonomy, and the serenity that results from changing your habits to suit your needs. Tragedy and Hope. Love the message. Don't hate the messenger. Until next time, I'm Richard Grove, and I thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.